The California sun beat down on the asphalt as Helena Reyes stepped out of the transport vehicle, her boots hitting the ground with quiet purpose. She reached back and pulled out a long black case, the kind that announced its contents to anyone who knew what to look for. The weight felt familiar in her hands, comfortable, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. Across the compound, 3 men stood near the armory entrance, their conversation dying as they noticed her approach. The tallest one, broad-shouldered with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, crossed his arms and said something to his companions that made them chuckle. Helena kept her eyes forward, her expression neutral as she'd learned to keep it. Staff Sergeant Drake Morrison watched the new arrival with unconcealed skepticism. He'd been with the SEAL unit for 8 years, had seen plenty of sailors come and go, but this was different. This was the brass trying to make a point, he thought, sending a woman into a sniper role like it was some kind of social experiment. She can't weigh more than 130 pounds, Morrison muttered to the man beside him. Petty Officer Vince Callahan grinned and shook his head. They're really doing this, he said. They're really putting her on the team. Helena heard none of this, or rather, she heard it all and filed it away in the part of her mind that had learned to catalog doubt and dismissal. She'd heard it before, at basic training, at sniper school at her last assignment. The words changed slightly each time, but the sentiment remained constant, predictable as the sunrise. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar acts of courage where you're from. The base administration building stood ahead, its doors propped open to let the ocean breeze flow through. Helena shifted the rifle case to her other hand and pulled her orders from her cargo pocket, the paper crisp and official against her calloused fingertips. Inside her chest, her heart beat steady and slow, the same rhythm she'd trained herself to maintain since childhood, since her father first put a rifle in her small hands and taught her that patience was the deadliest weapon of all. Commander Nathan Cross sat behind his desk reviewing personnel files when a knock came. "Enter," he called, and looked up to see the woman from the morning's arrivals list. "Corporal Reyes," he said, standing and extending his hand across the desk. "Welcome to the unit." "Thank you, sir," Helena replied, her grip firm but not aggressive, her eyes meeting his directly. She stood at attention, the rifle case resting against her leg. Cross gestured to the chair across from him and sat back down. "I've reviewed your file," he said, his tone neutral, professional. "Impressive marksmanship scores. Your instructors had good things to say." Helena nodded once. "I do my best, sir." "You'll be bunking in Building 6, Cross continued, sliding a folder across the desk toward her. "Training schedule, team roster, operational protocols. We run a tight unit here, Corporal. Everyone pulls their weight. Everyone maintains standards. No exceptions." "Understood, sir," Helena said, taking the folder. Cross studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I won't pretend you won't face challenges here," he said finally. "This is a close team, been together a long time. They'll test you, as they test everyone new. Show them what you can do, and you'll earn your place." "Yes, sir," Helena replied, and something in her voice, some quiet certainty, made Cross look at her more carefully. "Dismissed," he said. "Report to the range at 0600 tomorrow. Staff Sergeant Morrison will be running qualifications." Helena stood, took her folder, and lifted her rifle case. As she turned to leave, Cross called after her. "Corporal," he said, and she paused at the doorway. "Good luck." She didn't smile, but her eyes acknowledged the sentiment before she stepped back into the sunlight. The walk to Building 6 took her past the team common area where Morrison and his companions had moved to a bench in the shade. She felt their eyes tracking her, measuring, judging. "That's our new sniper," Morrison said loud enough for her to hear. "Gonna be real interesting to see how this works out." Helena kept walking, her stride even and unhurried, the rifle case balanced perfectly in her grip. In her mind, she heard her father's voice from 20 years ago, patient and steady. "Let them talk, Mija," he'd said. "Word or just air. What matters is what you do when the moment comes. What matters is the shot." The morning air carried the salt smell of the ocean as Helena made her way to the range, her boots crunching on gravel in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd been awake since 4, had already run 5 miles along the perimeter fence, her breathing controlled and even throughout. Old habits died hard, and her father's voice still echoed in her mind. The body must be ready before the mind can focus, he told her countless times. The range sprawled across the eastern section of the base, targets set at varying distances from 50 to 1,000 meters. Morrison was already there, clipboard in hand, talking with Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, a veteran operator whose weathered face suggested he'd seen more combat than most men twice his age. They both turned as Helena approached. "Corporal Reyes," Morrison said, his tone flat. "You're early." "Yes, Staff Sergeant," Helena replied, setting her rifle case down on the shooting bench. Webb nodded at her, his expression neutral, observant. "Morning, Corporal," he said simply. Other team members began arriving as the sun broke the horizon. Petty Officer Vince Callahan showed up with Lance Corporal Brett Hoffman, both of them laughing about something until they noticed Helena. Their conversation dropped to murmurs, and Helena caught the word diversity before they moved to the opposite end of the firing line. "All right, listen up," Morrison called out once the team had assembled. "Standard qualifications today. 50 meters prone, 100 meters kneeling, 200 standing, 500 prone. 5 rounds each position. Corporal Reyes goes first." Helena heard the unspoken challenge in his voice, the way he emphasized her name. She moved to the firing line without comment, opened her case, and began assembling her rifle with practiced efficiency. The weapon came together in her hands like pieces of a puzzle she'd solved 1,000 times before. "Nice rifle," Webb commented from behind her. "Custom build?" "Yes, Chief," Helena said, not looking up from her work. "Had it configured after sniper school." Morrison watched her movements, searching for hesitation or uncertainty. She loaded her magazine with smooth precision, each round seated perfectly, her fingers moving with the kind of confidence that came from endless repetition. "Range is hot," Morrison announced. "Corporal, you may commence firing when ready." Helena dropped into prone position, her body finding the ground like water finding level. She pressed her cheek to the stock, her breathing slowing, and fired 5 rounds in quick succession. The targets at 50 meters showed tight groupings, all center mass. "Kneeling position," Morrison called. She transitioned smoothly, her movements economical and controlled. 5 more rounds, 5 more impacts clustered in the kill zone. Hoffman whispered something to Callahan, and both men smirked. "Standing, 200 meters, Morrison said, his voice carrying a hint of anticipation. This is where many shooters struggled, fatigue setting in, the longer distance demanding more precision. Helena stood, adjusted her stance, and took her time with each shot. The targets rang out with each impact, and through the spotting scope, Webb could see the grouping remain tight, professional. 500 meters prone, Morrison called, and there was something different in his tone now, a slight edge. Helena returned to the ground, her body settling into position with a kind of stillness that seemed almost unnatural. She made a small adjustment to her scope, calculated for wind and distance, and fired. 5 rounds, 5 impacts. Morrison walked to check the targets himself, Webb following. When they returned, Morrison's face was carefully neutral. "Adequate," he said. "You meet minimum standards." Webb said nothing, but his eyes lingered on Helena for a moment longer than necessary. He'd seen thousands of qualification shoots in his career, and what he'd just witnessed was far from merely adequate. It was controlled, efficient, and showed a level of comfort with a weapon that suggested extensive experience. The rest of the team took their turns, and Helena watched from the side, noting their techniques, their breathing patterns, the small tells that revealed their skill levels. Morrison shot well, his groupings tight and consistent. Callahan was competent, but rushed his shots slightly. Hoffman showed promise, but lacked the patience required for longer distances. After qualifications ended, the team gathered near the armory to clean weapons. Helena worked alone at the far bench, breaking down her rifle with meticulous care. Each component was examined, cleaned, and reassembled with the kind of attention that spoke to deep respect for the equipment. So, Callahan said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, how exactly does someone become a SEAL sniper these days? Is it like a special program now, or something? Hoffman laughed, and Morrison didn't stop them. Helena continued her work, her hand steady as she ran a cleaning rod through the barrel. Chief Webb, cleaning his own weapon at the adjacent bench, glanced over at her, then back at his work. He'd been in the teams long enough to recognize when someone was being tested and long enough to know that the quiet ones often had the most to prove. As the morning wore into afternoon, Helena completed her tasks and returned to her quarters. Inside her locker, tucked behind her uniforms, was a worn photograph in a simple frame. Her father in his Army Ranger uniform, young and proud, a rifle slung over his shoulder. She touched the glass gently, remembering his lessons about patience, about letting skills speak louder than words. Time would tell, she thought. Time and opportunity. For now, she would do her job, maintain her standards, and wait for the moment when her true capabilities would matter more than anyone's preconceptions. The weeks settled into a rhythm that felt more like attrition than integration. Helena arrived first to every training session, stayed last to complete her tasks, and spoke only when spoken to. The team's skepticism had hardened into something more deliberate, more pointed. Thursday morning brought physical training, and Morrison seemed particularly interested in testing Helena's limits. The obstacle course stretched across 2 acres of unforgiving terrain, walls to scale, rope climbs, tire runs, and a final sprint that left most sailors gasping. "All right," Morrison called out as the team assembled at the starting line. "Standard course run. Corporal Reyes, you'll go first. Set the pace for everyone else." Callahan grinned at Hoffman. "This should be good," he muttered. Helena stepped to the line, her expression unchanged. Morrison raised his hand and dropped it. "Go!" She exploded forward, her compact frame covering ground with efficient strides. The first wall came up fast, 8 feet of vertical wood, and she hit its speed, her momentum carrying her up and over. The rope climb was next, and her arms pulled her body upward with steady power, hand over hand, no wasted motion. Morrison watched through narrowed eyes as she navigated the course, each obstacle cleared with competence that was hard to dismiss. She wasn't the fastest, but she was smooth, controlled, never panicking or rushing. When she crossed the finish line, her time was solidly in the acceptable range. "Not bad," Morrison said when she returned to the group. "For someone your size." The comment hung in the air, and Helena simply nodded, catching her breath. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," she said evenly. The rest of the team ran the course, and Helena noticed that Hoffman struggled on a rope climb, his technique sloppy, burning energy. Callahan was fast but reckless, nearly losing his footing on the tire run. Morrison ran last, his time the best of the group, and he made sure everyone knew it. That afternoon brought range time again, but this session was different. Gunnery Sergeant Rachel Torres had arrived from division headquarters to observe training protocols. She was a compact woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for seeing through pretense. "Morrison," Torres said as she approached the firing line, "I want to see moving target drills. Full team rotation." Moving targets were more challenging, requiring shooters to lead their aim, calculate speed and trajectory in real time. Morrison set up the mechanical systems, targets sliding along rails at varying speeds and distances. "Standard protocol," Torres said. 200 meters, lateral movement. 5 shots, best grouping wins. The team took turns, and the results were mixed. Callahan hit 3 out of 5. Hoffman managed 2. Morrison landed 4, his shots well-placed, but not exceptional. Webb, when his turn came, hit 4 as well, his decades of experience evident in his steady performance. "Corporal Reyes," Torres called. "You're up." Helena approached the line, loaded her magazine, and settled into position. The target began its lateral slide, moving left to right at a moderate pace. She tracked it with her scope, her breathing slowing, and fired. The first shot hit center mass. The second followed. Then the third, fourth, and fifth, each one finding the mark with precision that made Torres lean forward slightly. Morrison checked the target through his spotting scope, his jaw tightening. 5 for 5, he announced, his voice carefully neutral. Good shooting, Corporal, Torres said, making a note on her clipboard. Very good shooting. She got lucky, Callahan said quietly to Hoffman, but not quietly enough. Torres turned her sharp gaze on him. Something to add, petty officer? She asked. No, Gunnery Sergeant, Callahan replied quickly. That evening in the team common area, the mockery took on a new edge. Morrison sat with Callahan and Hoffman, their conversation loud enough to carry across the room where Helena sat alone, reading a manual on advanced ballistics. I'm just saying, Callahan said, there's got to be some kind of explanation. Nobody shoots like that without special consideration somewhere along the line. You mean like easier qualifications? Hoffman suggested. Morrison said nothing, but he didn't correct them either. His silence was permission, and they took it. Chief Webb entered the common area, grabbed coffee, and noticed Helena sitting alone. He'd been in the teams long enough to recognize talent when he saw it, and also long enough to recognize when politics were interfering with merit. He considered saying something, then decided against it. She'd have to prove herself on her own terms, he thought. That was how the teams worked. Helena turned a page in her manual, her expression unchanged, but inside she felt the familiar weight of isolation. It was nothing new, nothing she hadn't experienced before. Her father had warned her about this, had told her that being exceptional meant being alone until the moment came to demonstrate why exceptional mattered. She thought about the moving target drill, how natural it had felt, how the calculations had happened almost automatically in her mind. Distance, speed, wind, the slight elevation difference, all of it processed in the fraction of a second before each shot. It was second nature now, had been since she was 12 years old, and her father had set up her first moving target in the hills behind their house. You don't shoot to impress, Mija, he'd told her. You shoot because when it matters, when lives depend on it, there's no room for anything less than perfect. Helena closed her manual and stood, walking past the group of men without acknowledging them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, and she would meet them the same way she'd met everything else, with patience, precision, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of, even if no one else did yet. The operations briefing room filled with the quiet shuffling of bodies finding seats, the scrape of chairs against tile, the rustle of notepads being opened. Helena entered last, taking a seat in the back corner as Commander Cross stood at the front beside a projection screen showing satellite imagery of a coastal region. All right, settle in, Cross said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. We've got a training operation scheduled for next month. Full scenario, coordinated with Air Wing and Maritime. This is the real deal, everything but live targets. The team leaned forward, interest evident on every face. These large-scale exercises were where reputations were built, where operators proved their worth in conditions that mimicked actual combat as closely as peacetime allowed. Morrison, you'll be running tactical command, Cross continued. I need your team selections by end of week. Sniper positions, assault elements, support roles. Full brief next Monday. Morrison nodded, already making notes. Helena watched from the back, waiting for her assignment, for the indication of where she'd fit into the operation. But as Cross continued detailing the exercise parameters, her name never came up. Position after position was outlined, and she remained unmentioned. After the briefing ended, Helena approached Cross's desk as the room emptied. Sir, she said quietly, where do you need me for the exercise? Cross looked up from his papers, and something flickered across his face. Regret, maybe, or just pragmatism. Corporal, he said, Morrison's building his team based on established cohesion. You'll remain on base during the exercise, continue individual training protocols. The words landed like a physical blow, though Helena's expression never changed. Understood, sir, she said. Don't take it personally, Cross added, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. There'd be other opportunities. Helena left the briefing room and walked across the compound, the afternoon sun beating down on her shoulders. Behind her, she heard laughter from the team common area, celebration already beginning for an operation still weeks away. She kept walking. That evening, while the team gathered to plan and strategize, Helena returned to the range alone. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the base had grown quiet. She set up targets at 600 meters, longer than standard training distances, and began working through a series she'd designed herself. Each shot required calculation, adjustment for the changing light, the evening breeze picking up from the ocean. She fired, observed, made microscopic changes to her scope, and fired again. The rhythm was meditative, the mathematics of trajectory and wind drift occupying the part of her mind that might otherwise dwell on exclusion and dismissal. Petty Officer Luis Ortega was heading to the mess hall when he noticed the distant crack of rifle fire. Curious, he detoured toward the range and found Helena in prone position, working through her drill with focused intensity. He watched from a distance, observing the way she adjusted her position between shots, the deliberate pause she took before each trigger pull. The targets at 600 meters showed tight groupings that would have impressed most shooters. Ortega had been in the teams for 5 years, had worked with snipers who'd built careers on less consistent performance. He said nothing, just watched for a few more minutes before continuing to the mess hall. Inside the team planning room, Morrison had spread maps across a long table, marking positions and movement patterns. Webb stood beside him, offering suggestions based on terrain analysis. Callahan and Hoffman were assigned to assault positions, their excitement barely contained. "What about Reyes?" Webb asked, his tone neutral but pointed. Morrison didn't look up from his maps. "She's not ready for this level of operation," he said. "Better she gets more time to adjust to the team." Webb considered pushing back, then decided against it. He'd seen this pattern before, the way new members were sometimes frozen out until they found a way to force recognition. It wasn't always fair, but it was how tight teams protected their cohesion. At least, that's what Webb told himself. Commander Cross sat in his office later that night, Helena's personnel file open on his desk. The records told a story that didn't match the team's assessment of her. Expert marksmanship ratings across the board. Instructors' comments uniformly positive. Completion of advanced courses with distinguished marks. He flipped to her background section, scanning details he'd glossed over during her arrival. Father, Army Ranger, killed in action. That explained some of the intensity he'd seen in her eyes, the quiet determination. People who grew up around military excellence often carried it differently than those who found it later. Cross closed the file and looked out his window toward the darkened range. A single light marked where someone was still working, and he suspected he knew who. He thought about intervening, about forcing Morrison to include her in the operation, but leadership sometimes meant letting teams work through their own dynamics. Or at least that's what he wanted to believe. Helena fired her final round of the evening, the target ringing out in the growing darkness. She stood, began breaking down her rifle with the same meticulous care she showed every piece of equipment. Around her, the base had settled into its nighttime rhythm, but inside her mind, calculations continued. Distance, wind, elevation, all the variables that turned shooting from skill into an art form. Her father had taught her that the rifle was just a tool, that the real weapon was the mind behind it. Patience, he'd said, precision, and the absolute certainty that when the moment came, you would be ready. She packed her equipment, secured her rifle case, and walked back toward her quarters under a sky full of stars, alone but not lonely, excluded but not defeated. 3 weeks passed in a blur of routine and isolation. Helena maintained her training regimen while the team prepared for their exercise, their excitement building with each passing day. She ran her miles, cleaned her weapons, and studied advanced ballistics texts that most shooters never bothered to read. Then came the morning that changed everything. Commander Cross called an emergency all-hands meeting, his expression grave as the team assembled in the briefing room. Even Helena was summoned, standing at the back while Morrison and his selected operators filled the front rows. Change of plans, Cross announced without preamble. Division has modified the exercise parameters. They want to test our capabilities under more challenging conditions. We're adding a long-range precision element. Morrison straightened in his chair. Sir, we've already finalized the team composition. I'm aware, Cross said. But this new element requires specialized skills. We need someone who can make shots at extreme distances in less than ideal conditions. This isn't standard sniper work, Morrison. This is something else. The room fell quiet. Webb glanced at Morrison, then back at Cross. What kind of distances are we talking about, sir? Cross pulled up a new slide showing terrain maps and elevation charts. Targets at 800 to 1200 meters, he said. Variable wind conditions, moving observations, time constraints. Division wants to see if we can perform surgical strikes at extended range while coordinating with assault elements. Morrison's jaw tightened. My shooters can handle it, sir. Can they? Cross asked, and there was an edge to his voice that made everyone pay attention. Because the scoring metrics on this have changed. This isn't just about completing the exercise. This is about demonstrating capabilities that could determine future mission assignments and funding. The weight of that statement settled over the room. Future missions meant real operations, and real operations meant the difference between a unit that deployed and one that trained endlessly without purpose. Torres sent me updated performance analytics, Cross continued, pulling up another slide. These are qualification scores from the past month, including moving target accuracy, long-range precision, and environmental adaptation. Helena's name sat at the top of every category, her scores significantly higher than the rest of the team. Morrison stared at the screen, his face reddening. Callahan shifted uncomfortably. Hoffman looked down at his boots. Corporal Reyes, Cross said, and Helena straightened. You're now primary sniper for the exercise. Morrison, adjust your team composition accordingly. Sir, Morrison began, but Cross cut him off with a raised hand. This isn't a discussion, Staff Sergeant. We have 3 weeks to prepare, and I need your best people in the right positions. Is that understood? Yes, sir, Morrison said through clenched teeth. The meeting adjourned, and the team filed out in uncomfortable silence. Helena remained behind as Cross gathered his materials. Corporal, he said without looking up, you'll meet with Gunnery Sergeant Torres tomorrow morning. She'll brief you on the specific requirements and expectations. Yes, sir, Helena replied. Cross finally looked at her. This is your opportunity, he said. Don't waste it. I won't, sir, Helena said, and there was something in her voice, a quiet certainty that made Cross believe her. That afternoon, Helena found herself in the armory conducting a detailed equipment check when Ortega approached. He'd been watching her from a distance for weeks, had seen things the others either missed or chose to ignore. Heard you're on the exercise now, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Yes, Helena replied, continuing her work. Morrison's not happy about it, Ortega observed. I gathered that, Helena said. Ortega watched her for a moment, the way her hands moved over her equipment with practiced familiarity. Look, he said, I've been doing this for a while. I've seen a lot of shooters come through. You're different. Helena paused, finally looking up at him. Different how? You don't shoot like someone who's trying to prove something, Ortega said. You shoot like someone who already knows. Like it's just part of who you are. Helena considered this, then returned to her equipment check. My father was a sniper, she said quietly. Army Rangers. He taught me before I could ride a bike. Ortega nodded slowly. That explains some things, he said. What happened to him? Kia, Afghanistan, Helena said. I was 15. I'm sorry, Ortega said, and meant it. Helena closed her equipment case and stood. He taught me that being good wasn't enough, she said. That you had to be so good that when the moment came, there was no question, no doubt. Just a shot. Ortega understood. Well, you've got your moment coming, he said. 3 weeks. I know, Helena replied. That evening, Morrison gathered his team in the common area. Everyone except Helena. His frustration was evident in every line of his body, in the way he paced while the others sat and watched. "This is politics," he said. "Plain and simple. Cross is trying to make a statement." Webb, sitting in the corner, said nothing. He'd reviewed the same analytics Cross had shown, had seen the numbers that couldn't be argued with. Helena's performance was objectively superior, but Morrison wasn't ready to accept that reality. "We train together," Morrison continued. "We operate together. Throwing someone in at the last minute disrupts cohesion." "She's been here for a month," Webb finally said, "and her numbers are solid." Morrison turned to him. "You're defending this?" "I'm reading the data," Webb replied evenly. "If she can make those shots, we need her making them." Morrison's response died on his lips as Commander Cross appeared in the doorway. "Gentlemen," he said, "I expect professional conduct during this exercise. Whatever personal feelings exist, they stay here. On the field, we're one unit. Am I clear?" "Yes, sir," came the chorus of responses. Cross left, and the room remained silent. Helena, in her quarters, was running calculations in a notebook, mapping wind patterns and elevation changes for the terrain they'd be operating in. She didn't need 3 weeks to prepare. She'd been preparing her entire life. But 3 weeks would give her time to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no room for doubt, no space for dismissal. Just the impossible shot that would silence every question. The morning of the exercise arrived, with heavy clouds rolling in from the Pacific, the kind of weather that made long-range shooting exponentially more difficult. Helena stood on the ridge overlooking the exercise area, watching the wind push the clouds across the sky in irregular patterns. Perfect conditions for failure, she thought, or perfect conditions to prove something that couldn't be ignored. Torres arrived in a tactical vehicle, her expression all business as she climbed out and surveyed the terrain. "Corporal," she said, walking up beside Helena. "Weather's not cooperating." "No, gane sergeant, Elena replied. Torres pulled out a rangefinder and began taking measurements. "Your primary position is here on this ridge," she said. "Secondary fallback is 200 meters east. Targets will be marked by smoke at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters. You'll have observers calling wind and movement, but ultimately, the shots are yours." "Understood," Helena said, already calculating sight lines and potential obstacles. Torres turned to face her directly. "I'm going to be honest with you, Corporal. Division is watching this closely. Commander Cross stuck his neck out getting you this position. Morrison's filed complaints. There are people who want to see you fail." Helena met her eyes. "What do you want to see, Gunnery Sergeant?" Torres allowed herself a small smile. "I want to see if you're as good as your score suggests," she said. "Because if you are, you'll change some minds today. And if you're not, it's going to make things harder for everyone who comes after you." The weight of that responsibility settled on Helena's shoulders, but it wasn't unfamiliar. She'd carried it since her father died, since she decided to follow in his footsteps despite everyone telling her it was impossible. The team assembled at the operations center, a temporary structure erected for exercise command and control. Morrison ran through the tactical plan, his voice clipped and professional. Assault elements would move on targets at designated times, coordinated with Helena's fire support. Webb would be her spotter, feeding her information on wind and target movement. Callahan and Hoffman were assigned to the assault team, their faces showing barely concealed satisfaction at being in direct action roles, while Helena sat alone on a ridge. Morrison gave them their briefing with detail and care, then turned to Helena almost as an afterthought. "Corporal, you'll receive target coordinates via radio," he said. "Take your shots when you have them. Try not to miss." The casual dismissal in his tone was clear, but Helena simply nodded. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," she said. Webb gathered his spotting equipment and fell in beside Helena as they moved to their position. The climb to the ridge was steep, and they moved in silence, conserving energy. When they reached the top, Webb began setting up his scope while Helena prepared her rifle. "You ready for this?" Webb asked, his tone neutral. "Yes, Chief," Helena replied, checking her equipment with methodical precision. Webb studied her for a moment. "Morrison wants you to fail," he said bluntly. "So does half the team." Helena adjusted her scope, her movements calm and practiced. "I know," she said. Does that bother you? Webb asked. Helena settled into her shooting position, getting comfortable behind her rifle. My father told me something once, she said. He said the target doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care if people believe in you or doubt you. It just sits there, waiting. All that matters is whether you can hit it. Webb nodded slowly. Smart man, your father. He was, Helena said quietly. The radio crackled to life. All elements, this is command. Exercise begins in 5 minutes. Sniper team, confirm position. Webb keyed his radio. Sniper team set, primary position. Standing by. Helena scanned the terrain through her scope, identifying the marked target areas. 800 meters to the first position, 950 to the second, 1100 to the third. The wind was gusting irregularly, pushing clouds across the valley and creating swirling patterns that would make consistent shooting nearly impossible. Exercise hot. Morrison's voice came through the radio. Assault team moving to objective Alpha. Helena watched through her scope as the assault element advanced across the valley below. They moved with practiced efficiency, covering ground quickly. Then the first target indicator appeared. Orange smoke marking a position at 800 meters. Sniper team, you have target Alpha, Morrison said. Engage when ready. Webb pressed his eye to his spotting scope. Wind left to right, gusting at 12 knots, he reported. Target stationary. Your call. Helena's breathing slowed, her body settling into absolute stillness. She calculated wind drift, elevation difference, air density in the heavy weather. The mathematics happened automatically now, decades of training reducing complex physics to instinct. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, and through the scope she watched the round impact center mass on the target, 6 inches from the smoke marker. Hit, Webb called. Center mass. Confirmed, Morrison said, and there was surprise in his voice despite his attempt to hide it. The assault team continued moving, and more targets appeared. 900 meters, then 950, each one requiring adjustment for the changing wind and different elevations. Helena fired, adjusted, fired again. Each shot found its mark. Callahan's voice came through the radio. Is she actually hitting these? Confirmed hits, Webb replied. All targets engaged successfully. In the operations center, Commander Cross stood beside Torres, watching the exercise unfold on monitors fed by overhead drones. Every shot Helena took was being recorded, every hit or miss documented for the division observers who determine the unit's readiness rating. She's good, Torres said quietly. She's better than good, Cross replied, watching another target marker disappear as Helena's round found home. On the ridge, Helena maintained her rhythm. Breathe, calculate, fire, observe. Each shot was a conversation between her and the target, everything else falling away. The wind shifted, and she adjusted. The light changed as clouds moved, and she compensated. This was what her father had trained her for, what every hour on the range had prepared her to do. Then Morrison's voice cut through the radio with an edge of tension. Sniper team, new target at 1150 meters. Priority engagement. This is your long shot, Corporal. Helena shifted her scope to the new position, and her heart rate stayed steady even as she registered the difficulty. 1150 meters in gusting wind with changing light conditions. The kind of shot that tested the limits of equipment and shooter alike. The kind of shot that would either silence doubt or confirm it. The target at 1150 meters sat in a valley depression, partially obscured by the shifting weather. Helena studied it through her scope, watching the wind indicators, the way grass bent and recovered, the movement of dust and debris that told stories about air currents invisible to the naked eye. Webb pressed his eye to the spotting scope, running calculations on his datapad. Winds all over the place, he said, gusting between 10 and 15 knots, direction changing every 30 seconds. You got maybe a 20-second window when it stabilizes. Helena adjusted her position slightly, feeling the ground beneath her, the way the ridge channeled wind in unpredictable patterns. She made shots like this before, in competitions her father had entered her in when she was barely old enough to carry the rifle. But never with this much riding on it, never with an entire team's respect hanging in the balance. Sniper team, what's your status? Morrison's voice carried impatience. Assessing conditions, Webb replied. Stand by. In the operations center, Cross watched the overhead feed showing Helena's position on the ridge. The division observers stood behind him, their expressions neutral but their clipboards active, documenting every moment. This shot would define the exercise, would determine whether their unit received high readiness marks or was relegated to extended training status. Torres stood beside Cross, her arms crossed. She's taking her time, one of the observers commented. It's a difficult shot, Torres replied. Rushing it guarantees failure. On the ridge, Helena closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out everything except the feel of the wind on her face, the sound it made moving through the valley below. Her father had taught her this, to trust her body's ability to read conditions that instruments could only approximate. The wind is alive, Mija, he'd said. Learn to listen to it. She opened her eyes and settled deeper into her position. The wind gusted hard, then died slightly, then gusted again. But there, in the pattern, she found a rhythm. 3 seconds of strong wind from the left, 2 seconds of relative calm, then the cycle repeated. She watched through her scope, confirming the pattern twice, 3 times. Wind settling into a pattern, she said to Webb. I'm taking a shot on the next calm cycle. Webb checked his instruments. You sure? The readings are still showing high variance. I'm sure, Helena said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio again. Sniper team, we need that target engaged. Assault element is exposed waiting for your fire support. Copy that, Webb replied. Shooter is ready. Helena waited, watching the grass bend, watching the dust swirl. The wind gusted hard, and she let it pass. Then the calm came, that brief moment when nature held its breath. She squeezed the trigger with the same gentle pressure she'd learned 20 years ago, the same motion that had become as natural as breathing. The rifle's report echoed across the valley, and time seemed to slow as the round traveled downrange. 1,150 meters was a long conversation between bullet and distance, long enough for doubt to creep in, for second-guessing to take root. But Helena felt none of that. She knew, with the certainty that came from perfect execution, that the shot was true. Hit, Webb called, his voice rising slightly with surprise. Direct center mass. Morrison was silent for a beat too long. Confirmed, he finally said, Good shot. In the operations center, one of the division observers let out a low whistle. That was exceptional, he said to Cross. Environmental conditions alone made that a 5% probability shot. Cross allowed himself a small smile. Corporal Reyes is full of surprises, he said. The exercise continued, and Helena engaged 6 more targets over the next 2 hours, each shot successful despite deteriorating weather conditions. The clouds had dropped lower, visibility decreasing, wind becoming more erratic. Conditions that would have forced most shooters to call off operations entirely. Callahan's voice came through the radio as the assault team secured their final objective. I'll be damned, he said. She's hitting everything. Hoffman's response was quieter, harder to make out. Maybe we underestimated her. On the ridge, Helena maintained her focus, but she'd heard the exchange. Webb had heard it too, and he glanced at her with something approaching respect. You're making believers out of them, he said. Helena adjusted her scope for the next target. I'm just doing my job, Chief, she replied. The final phase of the exercise involved moving targets, mechanical systems designed to simulate enemy personnel repositioning under fire. The targets moved at variable speeds, appearing and disappearing behind terrain features. Standard protocol called for a 30% hit rate on moving targets at extreme range. Anything above 50% was considered exceptional. Sniper team, multiple mobile targets entering engagement zone, Morrison called. Engage at discretion. Helena tracked the first target through her scope, calculating speed and trajectory. The mathematics were more complex now, requiring her to predict not just where the target was, but where it would be when the bullet arrived. She led the target, accounting for its speed and the wind drift, and fired. Hit, Webb called. She shifted to the second target, faster moving, more erratic in its pattern. She watched it for 3 seconds, found the rhythm in its movement, and fired again. Hit. Over the next 15 minutes, she engaged 12 moving targets. 11 found their mark. The single miss came when the wind gusted unexpectedly just as she fired, pushing the round 6 inches wide. Still close enough to be recorded as a near miss, but Helena felt it like a personal failure. Outstanding performance, Torres said through the radio, her voice carrying genuine admiration. Exercise complete. All teams return to base. The assault element cheered, their voices carrying across the radio. Morrison was silent, and Helena imagined she could hear the gears turning in his mind, recalculating assumptions he'd held for weeks. Webb began packing up his spotting equipment. That was something special, he said. I've been doing this for 15 years, worked with shooters from every branch. What you just did, in these conditions, that's world-class. Helena disassembled her rifle with the same careful attention she always showed. Thank you, Chief, she said. They made their way down from the ridge as the rain finally began to fall, light at first, then heavier. By the time they reached the operations center, the valley was obscured by sheets of gray water. Torres met them at the entrance, a rare smile on her face. Division observers want to see you, she said to Helena. Commander Cross, too. This is going to be interesting. Helena followed Torres inside, water dripping from her gear, her rifle case slung over her shoulder. In the main room, the assault team had gathered, and they fell silent as she entered. Morrison stood near the back, his expression unreadable. Callahan and Hoffman looked at their boots. Only Ortega met her eyes, and he nodded with genuine respect. Commander Cross stood at the front of the operations center with 2 division observers flanking him, their uniforms crisp despite the weather outside. The room had cleared except for the core team, Morrison included, all waiting to hear the assessment that would determine their unit's future operational status. Gentlemen, Cross began, then corrected himself with a glance at Helena and Corporal Reyes. The division observers have completed their evaluation. Captain Andrea Sullivan, the senior observer, stepped forward. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes carried the weight of 3 decades in naval special operations. I'll be direct, she said. This unit's performance today exceeded expectations in every measurable category. Coordination was excellent. Assault elements executed flawlessly, and support operations were textbook. She paused, letting the compliment settle before continuing. However, what elevated this from a passing grade to an exceptional rating was the sniper performance. She turned to face Helena directly. Corporal Reyes, your hit rate today was 92% across all targets, including moving and extreme range engagements, in weather conditions that should have reduced effectiveness by at least 40%. The room was silent. Morrison's jaw worked as he processed the numbers. Webb nodded slowly, having witnessed every shot himself. Ortega allowed himself a slight smile. The 1150-meter shot, Sullivan continued, has been reviewed by our technical team. Given wind variance, elevation differential, and target profile, our computers calculated a 7% probability of success. You made it look routine. Helena stood at attention, her face carefully neutral. Thank you, ma'am, she said. Sullivan turned back to Cross. Commander, your unit receives high readiness status. You're cleared for deployment consideration on future operations. She glanced at her notes. I'm also recommending that Corporal Reyes be evaluated for advanced marksmanship instructor certification. Skills of this caliber should be shared with the broader community. Cross nodded, allowing himself a broader smile now. Excellent news, Captain. Thank you. As the observers departed, the tension in the room shifted. Morrison stood near the wall, his arms crossed, his expression conflicted. The data was undeniable, the performance recorded and verified. Everything he'd assumed about Helena had been proven wrong in the most public way possible. Corporal Reyes, Cross said, you're dismissed. Excellent work today. Helena saluted and left the operations center, stepping back into the rain. Behind her, She heard Cross begin speaking to the team, but his words were lost to the sound of water drumming on metal roofing. She walked across the compound toward her quarters, her rifle case protected under her jacket, rain soaking through her uniform. Halfway there, footsteps splashed behind her. She turned to find Ortega jogging to catch up. "Hey," he called. "Hold up." Helena stopped, waiting as he reached her. "That was incredible," he said, rain running down his face. "I mean, I knew you were good from watching you train, but today that was different." "Just doing my job," Helena replied, the same line she'd given Webb. Ortega shook his head. "No, it was more than that. That 1150 shot, Webb said you called the wind pattern when his instruments were showing chaos." "How'd you know?" Helena considered the question, remembering her father's lessons in the hills behind their house, learning to read nature's rhythms before she could read books. "Experience," she said finally. "Lots of practice." "Your father," Ortega said. "He taught you all this?" Helena nodded. "From the time I was 6 until he deployed for the last time. Every weekend, every summer, every spare moment. He said if I was going to do this, I needed to be better than good. I needed to be undeniable." "Well," Ortega said, "you're definitely that now." They stood in the rain for a moment longer before Ortega spoke again. "Morrison's struggling with this," he said. "His whole worldview just got challenged. Give him time." Helena looked toward the operations center where lights still burned. "I don't need his approval," she said. "I just need to do my job." "Fair enough," Ortega said. "But for what it's worth, you changed some minds today. Mine included. I thought I knew what elite shooting looked like. You show me I didn't." After Ortega left, Helena continued to her quarters, stripped off her wet uniform, and sat on her bunk in the quiet. The adrenaline from the exercise was fading, leaving behind the familiar hollow feeling that followed vindication. She'd proven herself, silenced the doubters, demonstrated capabilities that couldn't be dismissed. But she knew from experience that one performance, however exceptional, wouldn't erase weeks of skepticism and dismissal. Trust built slowly in teams like this, and she'd just taken the first real step. The question was whether Morrison and the others would let that step lead somewhere, or whether they'd find new reasons to maintain their distance. That evening, the team gathered in the common area for the traditional post-exercise debrief. These sessions were usually relaxed affairs, operators sharing stories and critiquing their own performance with the honesty that came from mutual respect. Helena almost didn't go, but Webb had specifically asked her to attend. When she entered, conversation didn't stop entirely, but it shifted. Hoffman glanced at her and nodded. Callahan actually made space at one of the tables. Morrison sat in his usual corner, nursing coffee and reviewing notes. Webb stood and called the room to attention. "All right," he said. "Let's talk about today. What worked, what didn't, what we need to improve." The debrief proceeded normally, each element discussing their performance. The assault team had executed well, with only minor timing issues. Communications had been solid throughout. Support coordination had been seamless. Then Webb turned to Helena. "Corporal," he said, "talk us through your process. How did you maintain that hit rate in those conditions?" Helena stood, feeling every eye in the room on her. She'd never been comfortable with public speaking, but technical discussion was different. That was just sharing information. "I mapped wind patterns before engaging," she said. "Found the rhythm in what looked like chaos. Each target required individual calculation based on real-time conditions, not preset data." "The 1150 shot?" Hoffman asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Webb said you called it when the instruments showed it was impossible." Helena nodded. "Instruments measure averages," she said, "but wind moves in patterns. If you can find the pattern, you can find the window. My father taught me to trust what I felt as much as what I measured." "Your father was a ranger," Webb said. "He trained you for this?" "Since I was 6, Helena confirmed. He believed that excellence required dedication that started early and never stopped. Every weekend on the range, every summer studying ballistics. By the time I was 12, I was competing in national championships." Morrison looked up from his notes, something shifting in his expression. "National championships?" he asked. 3 gold medals," Helena said quietly. Junior Division Precision Rifle. Then 2 more in the Open Division before I enlisted. The room absorbed this information. Callahan exchanged glances with Hoffman. Webb nodded slowly, pieces clicking into place. Morrison set down his coffee and stood, walking to the front of the room where Helena stood. Morrison stood before Helena, the entire team watching the confrontation that had been building since her arrival. His face was unreadable, years of operational discipline masking whatever internal struggle was happening behind his eyes. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Then Morrison spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice. I dismissed your capabilities without giving you a fair chance to demonstrate them. That was wrong." Helena met his gaze steadily. She'd imagined this moment in various forms over the past weeks, had rehearsed responses in her mind. But now that it was here, she found the anger she'd expected to feel was absent, replaced by something closer to understanding. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," she said simply. Morrison continued, seeming to need to say more. "I've been in the teams for a long time. I've seen what I thought was the standard, and I let that standard become a limitation instead of a baseline. What you did today challenged everything I thought I knew about what was possible in those conditions." Webb spoke from his seat near the back. "She made the rest of us look like we were playing checkers while she was playing chess," he said. "Different level entirely." Callahan cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I said some things," he began, then stopped and started again. "I said some things that were out of line. About how you got here, about special programs. That was ignorant. I'm sorry." Hoffman nodded in agreement. "We all were," he added. "You earned this. We just didn't want to see it." Helena looked around the room at faces that had shown her nothing but skepticism and dismissal for weeks. Ortega smiled encouragingly. Webb raised his coffee cup in salute. Even Morrison's expression had softened into something approaching respect. "I appreciate the apologies," Helena said, "but I didn't do this to prove you wrong. I did it because this team needed someone who could make those shots, and I knew I could make them. That's all." "That's not all, though," Morrison said. "You could have made me look like a fool today. Could have complained to Cross about being excluded from the planning, about the way the team treated you. You didn't. You just showed up and performed. That says something about your character." Helena thought about her father, about the lessons he'd taught her that went beyond shooting. "Honor isn't about being right, Mija," he'd said. "It's about doing right, even when no one's watching, even when you'd be justified in doing less. My father taught me that excellence is its own reward," Helena said. "That respect earned through performance is worth more than respect demanded through complaint. I trusted that if I did my job well enough, the rest would follow." "Smart man," Webb said, echoing his earlier assessment. Torres entered the common area, her timing suggesting she'd been waiting for the right moment. She carried a folder and wore an expression that meant business. "Corporal Reyes," she said, "Commander Cross wants to see you. Bring your gear." Helena stood and followed Torres out, leaving the team to their debrief. As they walked across the compound, now dark except for security lights cutting through the rain, Torres spoke quietly. "What happened in there?" she asked. Morrison apologized. Helena replied. "The team too." Torres nodded. "Good. About time." She glanced at Helena. "How do you feel about it?" Helena considered the question. "Relieved," she said finally. "Not vindicated, just relieved that I can focus on the work now, instead of proving I belong." "That's mature," Torres said. "Most people would want to savor the victory more." "I've been underestimated before," Helena said. "This wasn't my first time proving people wrong. It probably won't be my last." They reached Commander Cross's office, where lights still burned despite the late hour. Torres knocked and entered, Helena following. Cross stood near a window, looking out at the rain-soaked base. He turned as they entered. "Corporal Reyes," he said. "Sit down." Helena took the offered chair, her posture straight despite the long day. Cross remained standing, his expression thoughtful. "I received a call from Captain Sullivan," he said. "She's recommending you for immediate advancement to instructor qualification. She also mentioned that Pacific Fleet is looking for a primary sniper for a specialized unit being formed. High-level operations, strategic targets, the kind of work that doesn't make the news. Helena felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice steady. "Sir?" Cross pulled out a file and opened it. "I've been reading your full record," he said. "Not just the highlights I skimmed during intake. Your father was Master Sergeant Thomas Reyes, Army Rangers. Kia during Operation Enduring Freedom. He was decorated, highly respected." "Yes, sir," Helena said quietly. "The file mentions that you enlisted on your 18th birthday," Cross continued, 3 days after your father's memorial service. "That you requested sniper training specifically to follow in his footsteps." Helena nodded, not trusting her voice. Cross closed the file. "I want to ask you something, Corporal, and I want an honest answer. Are you doing this to honor your father's memory? Or are you doing this because it's who you are?" The question cut deeper than Cross probably intended. Helena had asked herself the same thing countless times over the years. She'd thought she was doing it for her father, to complete the legacy he'd started teaching her. But somewhere along the way, it had become something else. "Both, sir," she said finally. "It started as honoring him. But the rifle, the calculations, the patience required, that became part of who I am. I don't know where his influence ends and my own nature begins anymore. Maybe they're the same thing." Cross nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. "The specialized unit I mentioned," he said. "They want to interview you next week. It's voluntary, and there's no pressure from me. But I think you should consider it. Your skills are wasted on standard operations." Helena absorbed this information. A week ago, she'd been excluded from training exercises, dismissed by her team, isolated and underestimated. Now she was being recommended for elite assignments, recognized by division leadership, and offered opportunities that most operators spent careers working toward. "I like to think about it, sir," she said. "I just got here. The team is just starting to come together." Cross smiled slightly. "The fact that you're concerned about team cohesion tells me you're the right person for it," he said. "But take your time. The opportunity will be there when you're ready." Torres walked Helena back to her quarters through the rain, and they paused outside the door. "You handle that well," Torres said. "Cross was testing you, seeing if success would make you arrogant or hasty." "I figured," Helena replied. Torres started to leave, then turned back. "Your father will be proud," she said. "Not just of your shooting, but of how you've conducted yourself through all of this. That matters more than the scores." After Torres left, Helena entered her quarters and sat on her bunk, exhaustion finally catching up with her. She pulled out the photograph of her father, studying his young face, the confidence in his eyes. She wondered if he'd faced similar challenges, similar doubts from peers who couldn't see past their own assumptions. The rifle case rested against the wall, and Helena ran her hand along its surface. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, or new tests of her patience. But tonight, for the first time since arriving, she felt like she belonged. Not because she'd forced acceptance, but because she'd earned it in the only way that mattered. 3 days after the exercise, Commander Cross called an unexpected all-hands meeting. The team assembled in the briefing room with the kind of energy that suggested something significant was happening. Helena entered to find the atmosphere completely transformed from her first weeks on base. Hoffman nodded as she passed. Callahan shifted to make room for her near the front. Morrison himself gestured to an empty seat beside Webb. "Settle in," Cross said, his expression serious. "We've received new intelligence that changes our training priorities. Division wants to test our capabilities against a simulation they're calling Apex Protocol. It's designed to represent worst-case scenario conditions, the kind of operation where everything that can go wrong does." The room leaned forward collectively. Webb exchanged glances with Morrison. Ortega's jaw tightened with the kind of anticipation that came from knowing challenge meant opportunity. Cross pulled up a terrain map on the screen. The scenario involves a high-value target in a fortified position, environmental conditions deliberately set to maximum difficulty. We're talking wind speeds up to 25 knots with irregular gusting, reduced visibility, extreme range requirements beyond anything we've trained for. "How extreme?" Morrison asked. 1,500 meters, Cross said, and the room went quiet. 1,500 meters with multiple obstacles, moving observation patterns, and a target window measured in seconds, not minutes. Helena felt her pulse quicken. 1,500 meters was beyond what most military snipers ever attempted in field conditions. It was the realm of specialized competition, shooting, and theoretical exercises. In combat conditions with high wind and limited time, it approached the impossible. Captain Sullivan specifically requested our unit for this test, Cross continued. She wants to see if yesterday's performance was exceptional luck or repeatable capability. She's bringing technical observers, recording equipment, and enough brass to make this politically significant. When? Webb asked. Tomorrow, Cross said. Oh, height 100, same range complex. This isn't optional, and this isn't just about unit ratings anymore. Sullivan told me that if we can demonstrate consistent capability at this level, we're looking at mission assignments that haven't been available to conventional SEAL units. We're talking Tier 1 operational consideration. The weight of that statement settled over the team. Tier 1 meant the highest level of special operations, missions that stayed classified decades after completion, work that defined careers, and sometimes changed strategic outcomes. Morrison stood. What do you need from us, sir? Cross looked directly at Helena. I need our sniper to tell me honestly if this is achievable, he said. Corporal Reyes, can you make a 1,500-meter shot in 25-knot winds with limited target windows? Every eye in the room turned to Helena. This was the moment that would define not just her place on the team, but potentially the trajectory of her entire career. She could hedge, could say she'd try her best, could cover herself with qualifications and maybes. That's what caution would dictate. But caution had never been her father's way. He'd taught her that confidence without arrogance meant knowing exactly what you were capable of and stating it clearly. She thought about the shots she'd made in competition, the conditions she'd trained in, the calculations she could run in her sleep. Yes, sir, she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. I can make that shot. Cross studied her for a long moment. You understand what's riding on this? He asked. If you miss, if you fail, it reflects on this entire unit. It affects every operation we might be considered for going forward. I understand, sir, Helena replied. And I'm telling you I can make the shot. Not that I'll try, not that I hope to. I can make it. Morrison spoke up. Sir, I like to work with Corporal Reyes on preparation. Webb 2. We should run through environmental calculations, verify equipment, make sure every variable is accounted for. Cross nodded. Do it. I want our best effort tomorrow. Dismissed. The team filed out, but Morrison caught Helena's arm. That was either very brave or very foolish, he said quietly. Do you really have that kind of confidence? Helena met his eyes. Staff Sergeant, I've been shooting since before I could write my own name. My father started teaching me when most kids were learning to ride bikes. By the time I was 14, I was making shots at 1,200 meters in competition conditions. 1,500 is at the edge of my capability, but it's not beyond it. Morrison studied her, then nodded. All right, let's make sure you have everything you need to prove that. They spent the rest of the day in preparation that bordered on obsessive. Webb reviewed every technical specification of Helena's rifle, checking tolerances and confirming zero. Ortega helped gather meteorological data, studying wind patterns and historical weather conditions for the range area. Morrison worked with Helena on calculated tables for 1,500-meter engagements, running scenarios, and backup plans. As evening approached, Torres arrived with Captain Sullivan and her technical team. They reviewed the exercise parameters in detail, explaining the specific requirements and success criteria. The target would appear for exactly 30 seconds, 3 times over a 2-hour window. Helena would have those 3 opportunities to hit it. 1 successful impact would be considered acceptable. 2 would be excellent. 3 would be unprecedented. Sullivan pulled Helena aside after the briefing. Corporal, she said, I need you to understand something. I'm not setting this up to watch you fail. I'm setting this up because I believe you can succeed, and I need to prove to people above my pay grade that conventional units can perform at this level. Yes, ma'am, Helena said. But if you feel any doubt, Sullivan continued, if you think the conditions are beyond your capability, Now is the time to say so. There's no shame in acknowledging limitations. Helena shook her head. I don't have doubt, ma'am, she said. I have a target, a distance, and environmental data. Everything else is mathematics and execution. I can do the math, and I can execute. Sullivan smiled. Your father raised you right, she said. He was one of the best rangers I ever worked with on joint operations. He had the same kind of certainty you're showing now. You knew him? Helena asked, surprise breaking through her composure. Sullivan nodded. Operation Anaconda, 2002. I was a lieutenant running forward observation. Your father's marksmanship saved my team when we were pinned down. He made shots I still don't understand how he calculated. She paused. He told me once that he was training his daughter to be better than he was. I guess he succeeded. Helena felt emotion rising in her chest, but forced it down. Thank you for telling me that, ma'am, she said. That night, Helena lay in her bunk, unable to sleep, her mind running through calculations and scenarios. 1,500 meters meant nearly 2 full seconds of bullet flight time. Every variable mattered at that distance. Temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes. Even the rotation of the Earth became relevant. She thought about her father, about Sullivan's revelation that they'd served together. She wondered if he'd known, when he was teaching her to shoot in those hills, that she'd end up here, attempting shots that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The photograph on her locker seemed to watch her in the darkness. She imagined his voice, calm and steady. Trust your training, Mija. Trust yourself. The rifle doesn't know what's impossible. Neither should you. Helena closed her eyes and finally found sleep. Her last conscious thought, a simple calculation. 1,500 meters, 25-knot crosswind, 30-second window. She'd made harder shots in her mind 1,000 times. Tomorrow she'd make it real. Dawn broke gray and windswept, the kind of morning that made long-range shooting less a science and more an act of faith. Helena stood at the ridge position, her rifle already assembled, checking and rechecking equipment she knew was perfect. Webb worked beside her, setting up his spotting scope with the same meticulous care. Below them, the operations center buzzed with activity. Captain Sullivan had arrived with a team of observers, their equipment sophisticated enough to measure every aspect of the shot from muzzle velocity to bullet drift. Commander Cross stood beside Morrison, both men wearing expressions that tried to project confidence while betraying underlying tension. Winds already gusting at 20 knots, Webb said, reading his instruments. And it's supposed to get worse. Helena nodded, feeling the air move across her face. The wind was alive this morning, unpredictable and aggressive. She closed her eyes and let it speak to her, searching for patterns in what seemed like chaos. Her father had taught her this, to feel wind the way musicians felt rhythm, to find the structure beneath apparent randomness. Torres climbed up to their position, breathing slightly hard from the steep ascent. Corporal, she said, Captain Sullivan wants to know if you need more time to assess conditions. Helena opened her eyes and looked downrange. The target area was barely visible at 1,500 meters, a dark shape against darker terrain. No, ma'am, she said. I'm ready when they are. Torres nodded and spoke into her radio. Sniper team is set. We're ready to begin. Sullivan's voice came through clearly. Understood. First target window opens in 5 minutes. Corporal Reyes, be advised that we have flag officers observing remotely. This exercise has generated significant interest at fleet level. Webb glanced at Helena. No pressure, right? He said with dark humor. Helena settled into her shooting position, her body finding familiar comfort in the prone stance. The rifle felt like an extension of herself, every contour known, every adjustment instinctive. She began her breathing cycle, slow and controlled, feeling her heart rate drop into the zone where precision lived. 3 minutes, Sullivan announced. Helena ran through her calculations one final time. Distance, elevation, wind speed at ground level and estimated at mid-trajectory altitude, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure. The mathematics created a 3-dimensional map in her mind, a pathway through space and time that her bullet would need to follow. At 1,500 meters with these conditions, she was looking at nearly 12 feet of wind drift and significant bullet drop. The margin of error was measured in inches. 1 minute, Sullivan said. Helena felt the wind gust hard, pushing against her, trying to disturb her position. She absorbed it, became part of it, letting her body move with the air rather than fighting it. This was the secret her father had taught her, that fighting nature was futile, but flowing with it, understanding it, that was where mastery lived. Target active, Sullivan announced. 30 seconds. Through her scope, Helena watched the target area. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then movement, a shape emerging, the target visible but only barely. She tracked it, her crosshairs finding center mass, and began her final calculations. The wind was gusting left to right, but there in the pattern she found the window. A brief moment when the chaos organized itself into predictability. She squeezed the trigger with pressure, so gentle it surprised even her, and the rifle spoke. The recoil was familiar, comfortable, and through her scope she maintained sight picture, watching. Nearly 2 full seconds passed, time stretching impossibly long. Helena didn't breathe, didn't blink, just watched the target through her scope. Impact, Webb called, his voice rising with excitement. Direct hit, center mass. In the operations center below, the technical observers confirmed what their instruments had recorded. Captain Sullivan allowed herself a smile. Commander Cross let out a breath he'd been holding for what felt like minutes. Morrison actually laughed, the sound carrying disbelief and admiration in equal measure. Confirmed hit, Sullivan announced through the radio. Outstanding shot, Corporal. Prepare for second target window in 45 minutes. Helena broke position and sat up, her hands steady despite what she'd just accomplished. Webb stared at her with something approaching awe. That was impossible, he said. The wind drift alone should have pushed that round 6 feet off target. It would have, Helena said, if I'd calculated for average wind speed. But the wind moves in waves. I waited for the trough and fired into it. Webb shook his head slowly. I've been spotting for snipers my entire career. I've never seen anyone read wind like that. How did you learn it? My father, Helena said simply. He taught me that instruments tell you what was, but your body tells you what is. You have to trust both. The second target window arrived, and this time the wind had intensified, gusting up to 28 knots. Conditions had deteriorated beyond what the exercise planners had anticipated. Sullivan came on the radio with an offer to postpone, but Helena declined. The target appeared, and she fired. 2 seconds of flight time, and the round found its mark again. 2 for 2, Webb reported, and this time his voice carried genuine amazement. In the operations center, one of the flag officers observing remotely spoke to Sullivan. Is this real? He asked. Are we actually watching someone make these shots in these conditions? Sullivan nodded. It's real, sir. And it's repeatable, apparently. The third window came an hour later, and by then word had spread through the base. Sailors not involved in the exercise had gathered near the operations center, watching monitors, listening to reports. The story of the impossible shots was already becoming legend, even as it happened. This time, when the target appeared, the wind was at its worst, gusting erratically with no discernible pattern. Helena watched through her scope, searching for the rhythm she'd always found before. But the chaos was deeper this morning, the patterns more complex. She waited, her breathing steady, trusting that the moment would come. 15 seconds remaining, Sullivan warned. Helena felt sweat on her palms despite the cool morning. This was the edge of her capability, the place where skill met luck and hoped for favorable odds. But then, in the final seconds, the wind shifted. Just for a moment, just long enough. She fired. The bullet traveled through space that seemed almost aware of its passage, crossing 1,500 meters in an arc that defied probability. In the operations center, everyone watched their screens with held breath. Webb pressed his eye to the spotting scope, tracking the round's trajectory. Hit, he called. 3 for 3. Perfect score. The operations center erupted in cheers. Sailors outside began applauding. Sullivan stood with her hands on her hips, shaking her head in disbelief. Even Morrison, stoic and controlled, was grinning openly. Cross keyed his radio. "Corporal Reyes," he said, "get down here. Captain Sullivan wants to talk to you." Helena secured her rifle and began the descent with Webb. As they walked, he spoke quietly. "That last shot," he said. "You hesitated. I've never seen you hesitate before." Helena nodded. "The pattern was harder to find," she said. "I almost missed the window entirely." "But you found it," Webb said. "That's what matters." They reached the operations center to find it packed with people. Sullivan stood at the center, surrounded by monitors still displaying recorded footage of all 3 shots. When Helena entered, the room fell silent. Sullivan approached her directly. "Corporal Reyes," she said, "what we just witnessed was historic. 3 shots at 1,500 meters in conditions that our technical team calculated as having less than 5% success probability each. You didn't just succeed, you demonstrated mastery that most shooters never approach in their entire careers." Helena stood at attention. "Thank you, ma'am." Sullivan turned to address the room. "This unit is now cleared for Tier 1 operational consideration," she announced. "And Corporal Reyes is being recommended for immediate transfer to the specialized maritime unit I mentioned previously." She paused, assuming she accepts the assignment. The celebration in the operations center continued around Helena, but she felt oddly detached from it, as if watching the scene from a distance. Officers congratulated her, technical observers requested interviews, and sailors she'd never met wanted to shake her hand. Through it all, she remained composed, professional, answering questions and accepting praise with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained through weeks of skepticism. Commander Cross eventually rescued her from the crowd, pulling her aside to his office where the noise was muffled by thick walls. "Sit down, Corporal," he said, gesturing to a chair. "We need to talk about your future." Helena sat, her rifle case resting against her leg, ever present. "Yes, sir," she said. Cross leaned against his desk, his posture relaxed, now that the pressure of the exercise had passed. "Captain Sullivan's offer is legitimate," he said. "The specialized unit she mentioned operates at the highest levels. You'd be working missions that most operators only dream about. It's a significant opportunity." Helena nodded, waiting for him to continue. But Cross said, and there was weight in that word, "You've also just transformed this unit. Your performance has elevated everyone's capabilities, shown them what's possible when assumptions are challenged and excellence is pursued without compromise. If you leave now, that lesson might not stick." Helena considered this. "Are you asking me to stay, sir?" Cross shook his head. "I'm asking you to make the choice that's right for you, not for me or this unit or anyone else. Your father understood something important. He knew that individual excellence could inspire collective improvement, but only if the individual stayed long enough to share what they knew." "What would you do, sir?" Helena asked. "If you were in my position?" Cross smiled slightly. "I'd probably take the specialized assignment," he said honestly. "The missions, the challenge, the opportunity to work at that level. But I'm not you, and I didn't grow up learning that excellence carries responsibility beyond personal achievement." Helena looked down at her rifle case, thinking about her father, about the hours he'd spent teaching her not just to shoot, but to understand why shooting mattered. It was never about personal glory for him. It was about the mission, the team, the people who depended on precision when everything else failed. "Can I have some time to think about it?" she asked. Cross nodded. "Sullivan's leaving tomorrow morning. Give her your answer by then." Helena left Cross's office and found the team gathered in the common area. The atmosphere transformed from the tense awkwardness of her first weeks. Morrison stood as she entered, followed by the rest of the team. They'd been waiting for her. "Corporal Reyes," Morrison said formally, then seemed to struggle with what came next. His usual command presence faltered, replaced by something more human. He started again. "Helena," he said, using her first name for the first time. "What you did today was remarkable. Not just the shooting, but the way you carried yourself through everything that came before. I was wrong about you in every way possible, and you handled it with more grace than I deserved." The team murmured agreement. Callahan stepped forward. "We heard about the specialized unit offer," he said. "We also heard you're thinking about it. And we wanted to say, before you decide, that we'd really like you to stay." Hoffman nodded. "We need someone who can show us what we're capable of," he said. "You've done that once, but there's so much more we could learn." Webb spoke for his position near the window. "You've got decisions to make that none of us can make for you," he said. "But whatever you choose, you should know that you've earned something rare in the teams. You've earned genuine respect, the kind that lasts beyond a single impressive performance. Ortega's Maid. Plus, if you leave, who's going to make the rest of us look like amateurs on the range?" The room laughed, and Helena felt the tension she'd carried for weeks finally release. These men had dismissed her, underestimated her, made her arrival deliberately difficult. But they'd also acknowledged their mistakes, adjusted their thinking, and opened themselves to learning. That took a different kind of courage than what she displayed on the range. "Thank you," she said. "All of you. I'll let you know what I decide." That evening, Helena sat alone in her quarters, the photograph of her father in her hands. She studied his young face, searching for guidance in features frozen decades ago. What would he want her to do? The specialized unit represented everything he'd trained her for, the pinnacle of operational excellence. But staying meant something too. It meant teaching, mentoring, showing others that excellence was achievable if pursued with dedication and humility. If you enjoyed the story, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite part, character, or if you've had a similar situation happen to you before. The next morning, Helena found Captain Sullivan in the operations center, reviewing final reports before her departure. "Ma'am," Helena said, "I have my answer about the specialized unit." Sullivan looked up, her expression neutral but interested. "Go ahead, Corporal." Helena took a breath. "I'm honored by the offer, ma'am. And 6 months ago, I would have accepted without hesitation. But I've learned something here that I didn't fully understand before. Excellence isn't just about what I can do. It's about what I can help others achieve." Sullivan studied her carefully. "You're turning down the assignment?" Helena nodded. "For now, yes, ma'am. This team needs someone who can push them beyond what they thought possible. They're willing to learn, and I'm willing to teach. Maybe in a year or two, when they've internalized these lessons, I'll be ready for that next step." Sullivan smiled, and there was approval in her expression. "Your father would be proud," she said. He understood that the best operators weren't always the ones with the highest scores or most impressive records. They were the ones who made everyone around them better. She extended her hand, and Helena shook it firmly. "The offer stands," Sullivan said. "When you're ready, contact me directly." That kind of capability doesn't expire. After Sullivan left, Helena walked to the range where the team was already assembled for morning training. Morrison saw her approaching and called everyone to attention. Helena waved them at ease and moved to the front of the group. "I've decided to stay," she announced, and the team's reaction was immediate and positive. Grins, nods, Ortega actually punching Hoffman's shoulder in celebration. "But if I'm staying," Helena continued, "we're going to do things differently. Starting today, we're implementing advanced marksmanship training for everyone. Not just sniper-qualified personnel, but the entire team. You're all going to learn to read wind, calculate drift, make shots you currently think are impossible." Morrison stepped forward. "I'm assigning you as lead marksmanship instructor," he said. "Whatever resources you need, whatever training time you require, you have it." Helena nodded. "Then let's start with the basics," she said. "How many of you can tell me the wind speed right now without checking instruments?" No one raised their hand. Helena smiled. "That's where we begin," she said. "My father taught me that the rifle is just a tool. The real weapon is understanding, preparation, and the absolute certainty that when the moment comes, you'll be ready." She spent the rest of the morning teaching them what her father had taught her, passing on knowledge that had been earned through years of dedication and sacrifice. Webb absorbed it eagerly, his experience allowing him to grasp concepts quickly. Morrison struggled initially with ideas that challenged his established methods, but his willingness to learn impressed her. Even Callahan and Hoffman showed genuine interest, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by respect for capability they could finally recognize. As the sun climbed higher and the training continued, Helena felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with purpose. Her father had taught her to shoot, but more importantly, he'd taught her that excellence shared was excellence multiplied. That evening, she stood on the same ridge where she'd made the impossible shots, looking out over the base as it settled into its nighttime routine. Webb joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might be up here," he said, offering her a cup. Helena accepted it gratefully. "Thanks, Chief." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Webb spoke. "You made the right choice," he said. "Staying, I mean. That specialized unit would have been impressive on your record, but what you're building here, this will matter more in the long run." Helena nodded. "My father used to say that the best shot he ever made wasn't the one that won a medal. It was the one he taught someone else to make when it mattered most." Webb raised his coffee cup in salute. "To your father, then," he said, "and to teaching the rest of us what we're really capable of." Helena touched her cup to his and looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, she imagined her father watching, proud not just of her shooting, but of her choice. She'd proven she could make impossible shots under impossible conditions. Now she'd proved that she could inspire others to do the same. And maybe, she thought, that was the more difficult and more important demonstration after all.